I was surprised to see how many people are here. Every time I turn around, it's more. My name is Rob Nossen. Obviously, I'm here. I'm a Holocaust survivor. I'm one of the few that survived. It's not really an honor, it's luck, okay? But before, I just want to, I've got plenty of time, so I can outwit last year probably. But I will be happy to answer questions after my presentation. Now, my presentation is going to be two parts. One is anti-Semitism, and the second part of it really is my story, and how because the Holocaust happened because of anti-Semitism. Now, there's a problem with anti-Semitism, the word itself, Semite. What does that refer to? It's not genetic. It's a language, Semitic languages. And Arabic, it's Hebrew and Arabic and the related Canaanite languages from the Middle East. So basically, when you say when you talk about Semites, it includes people in the Mideast and North Africa as well, because it's a language designation, not a racial or religious or anything else. But that's not the way it's being used today. Anti-Semitism, I want to show you a short clip, about 13 minutes, from the Holocaust Museum in Washington. That's the one. Hold on a second. Okay. Will we talk to him about that? But, okay, we're having a technical problem. The picture works, but I can't get the speaker to work. We need to hook the speaker up to the... Can you hear it or not? Give us a moment. In the meantime, this is kind of a 13-minute thing about the Holocaust. Not the Holocaust, but anti-Semitism. The history of anti-Semitism. And why is it important to understand? Okay. The reason it's important to understand that, because it evolved from different situations. And I'll go more into that after we watch this video. Okay. So, it didn't just happen overnight, but anti-Semitism is not just. The reality is it's been used to get primarily against the Jews. And the word anti-Semitism or Semitism didn't come into the language until late 1800s in Poland. It came out of Poland in the late 1800s to define the Jews. And that's why it's only used for Jews. It's not used for any other group that speak Arabic or Hebrew or anything else.
1945, the Nazis killed about 6 million Jews and millions of other civilians throughout Europe. These are some who were slaughtered in the Holocaust. A generation lost forever. Jews are the people of the Hebrew Bible who lived in a land now known as Israel. They believe that there is only one God. Christianity emerged from Judaism. Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew who preached a singular religious message. The first Christians were Jews who prayed in Hebrew and observed the customs and religious rituals of Judaism. The Last Supper was a Jewish religious meal, probably at Passover. Jesus was put to death at the hands of Roman authorities under Pontius Pilate in Judea, but the Gospel accounts were interpreted as blaming all Jews for the crucifixion. To his followers, Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah, his death, sacrificial atonement. Most Jews believed the Messiah had not yet come. Redemption was not at hand. Soon after the crucifixion, Roman armies destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. Jews were exiled and scattered to live as a dispersed minority. By the 5th century, Christianity had become the dominant religion in the Roman Empire. The early Christian church portrayed Jews as unwilling to accept the word of God. Illuminations showed Satan binding the eyes of the Jews. Some church leaders intensified the charge, condemning Jews as agents of the devil and murderers of God. The accusation was not renounced until the 1960s, when the Second Vatican Council officially repudiated the ancient charge that Jews had murdered Christ. For centuries, state and church laws restricted Jews, preventing them from owning land and holding public office. Guilds excluded Jews from most occupations, forcing them into pursuits like moneylending, trade, commerce. Excluded from Christian society, Jews maintained their religious and social customs. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem. Christian crusaders set off to free the Holy Land from the Muslims. On the way, they slaughtered thousands of Jews. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christians persecuted Jews. Portrayed as alien, Jews were regarded as usurers. It was said Jews poisoned the wells of Europe, causing the Black Plague. Illustrations depicted Jews as the devil, with horns and cloven feet, and showed them using the blood of Christian children in ritual sacrifices. These lies came to be taken as true. But where they were needed, Jews were tolerated. When they were allowed to participate in the larger society, Jews thrived. In many places, secular and religious states forced Jews into segregated districts later called ghettos. England, France, Spain, Portugal, and many German states expelled masses of Jews, most of whom migrated eastward, taking with them their religious convictions and traditions. In 1517, Martin Luther attacked the Pope and corruption within his own Roman Catholic Church, beginning the Protestant Reformation. The young Luther hoped that tolerance would persuade Jews to convert. But when Jews adhered to their own religious beliefs and refused to join his new Reformed church, Luther's disappointment turned to hatred. What then shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? Their synagogues should be set on fire, and what does not burn must be covered over with earth, so that no man will ever see stone or cinder of them again. Their houses also should be razed and destroyed. All their prayer books should be taken from them. The Protestant Reformation brought no end to the anti-Jewish tradition of Christianity. With the 18th century Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, the domination of the Church diminished. Some Enlightenment thinkers called for full rights for Jews, but only on the condition that they discard their religious customs. Others blamed Judaism as the source of irrational religious faith. Even though many Jews assimilated socially and culturally, prejudice did not disappear. In France, in 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, the only Jewish member of the French Army's general staff, was convicted of passing military secrets to Germany. Later, proof of forgery confirmed his innocence, but Dreyfus remained the victim of a cover-up to divert attention from Army corruption. A century after the French Revolution proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity, giving Jews their freedom, frenzied mobs in the streets of Paris chanted, "Death to the Jews." Religious discrimination had gradually changed into a thriving secular, political, and social antisemitism. Nevertheless, freed from some restrictions, many Jews entered the Christian world and became prominent citizens. Then, around 1900, a new lie was promoted, that Jews conspired to dominate the world using their money and intelligence to manipulate trusting Christians. Russian secret police forged a document to support the story of a takeover plot supposedly authored by a conference of Jewish leaders. A proven forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was nevertheless translated into every major language and distributed worldwide. It is circulated even today, despite indisputable proof that it is a fake. To divert popular discontent at appalling living conditions and autocratic control, Russian authorities encouraged anti-Semitic violence. Jews were blamed for the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. Pogroms, murderous rampages against Jews, erupted in Russia many times during the next 3 decades. The second half of the 19th century saw the emergence of yet another kind of anti-Semitism. At its core was the theory that Jews were not merely a religious group, but a separate race, Semites, set apart because of genetically inherited characteristics. Anti-Semites believed racial characteristics could not be overcome by assimilation or even conversion. Jews were said to be dangerous and threatening because of their, quote, Jewish blood. Anti-Semitic racism united pseudo-scientific theories with centuries-old anti-Jewish stereotypes. These ideas gained wide acceptance. The devastation of World War I, the demeaning Peace of Versailles, the hyperinflation of the 1920s and the Depression of 1929 fueled mass discontent. The presence of Jews in German cultural, economic, and political life made them convenient scapegoats for Germany's misfortunes. Enter Adolf Hitler. Hitler viewed world history as a racial struggle for survival of the fittest. He saw Jews as the source of all evil: disease, social injustice, cultural decline, capitalism, and all forms of Marxism, especially communism. Anti-Semitism would become the predominant ideology of the Third Reich. Nazi racism victimized many groups of people, but it was against the Jews that the Nazi state mobilized all its resources for terror. After the Nazi takeover of power, anti-Jewish measures were put into effect one after another. Jewish businesses were boycotted, then seized. Jews were defined, separated from non-Jews. Jews were excluded from professions and studies. Jewish children were barred from schools. Jews were subjected to public humiliation. The changes, whether gradual or sudden, were incomprehensible. Few could imagine what would happen, even Jews. The Nazis took anti-Semitism to an unprecedented level of violence. Genocide, the systematic murder of millions of people deemed inferior. Six million Jews. These are some of them.
I think one of the things, this is the reason I like to show this, because it kind of, in 13 minutes, it shows the history of what we call anti-Semitism. Started as a religious persecution, ended up into an ethnic, racial, or whatever you want to call it. There was during the Second World War, and it was it didn't lead to the Second World War, but it resulted in the Holocaust. Now, there's something about the Holocaust that, it's not just, the Holocaust is not just about the Jews, because a total of 12 million people died in the Holocaust. And again, it was to some degree, of those 6 million were Jews, and they represented 2/3 of the population of Jews in Europe, the pre-war Europe. In the Western countries, there were relatively few, but when you got to Poland and the history of the Jews, they were kicked out of a lot of countries and ended up settling in the East. Well, it used to be, because even as it was pointed out, they were, often they were kicked out rather than killed, or they were put into ghettos. Now, one of the reasons that happened was a edict or a doctrine in the Catholic Church at that time, 1,000 years ago, that blamed the Jews as the Christ killer. Now, were they complicit in going after Jesus? Yes. Did they kill him? No. Jews did not crucify. the Romans crucified. And so this is one of the things that has come up constantly. Much of this is related, the anti-Semitism related to the killing of Christ. It isn't. Okay? It is because Jews practiced a different religion. It morphed, as you saw, it morphed into racial or ethnic in the 1800s, away from religion. And to this day, much of it is. And it used to be, by the way, that often Jews would convert. They could be converted to Christianity, they converted to Islam, and the same thing with Christians. When the Muslims took over the Middle East, many people converted. So it was always the case, but the Jews were always a minority. In fact, I traveled much of the North Africa and Middle East, and Jews were in Saudi Arabia, they were in North Africa, throughout North Africa, and they often came with the Romans. They were traders, because Palestine at the time, it was a poor land, couldn't support all the people there, so they went out and became traders and spread throughout the Middle East, throughout the Mediterranean, and kept following the armies, the Roman armies. So that's how they ended up in different places. 1,000 years ago, they started moving east into Eastern Europe, which is, Poland, Russia, all those areas. And for a while, they were welcome because the populations were not that great, and they brought a lot of knowledge of city life and so forth, and skills. Over time, that's why the Jews, most of the Jews in Europe lived in the eastern part of Europe, not in the west. The country where I came from, I wasn't born there, but was Germany. Germany was a country, at the time of the First World War, was a country of 60 million people. Less than 1% were Jewish. So about 500,000 German Jews, and another thing is 100,000 Polish Jews. Now the other thing about it that we need to talk about, and you hear you've all heard of birthright, right? It's in the news all the time now. In the United States, if you're born here, under birthright, you're automatically a citizen. That's not the case in Europe. So even though so many Jews that were living in Germany, born in Germany, were actually Polish. Most of the Jews in the United States, by the way, came in the 1880s from Russian areas, Russian Empire. Why? Because of what they call pogroms, so there were attacks on the Jews. So at that point, that's when major migration came to the United States. Over 2 million Jews came to the United States between 1880 and 1914. But the people that but these were not German Jews, because in Germany there was less anti-Semitism as we define it today as there was in many other countries. And that's where my parents lived for generations, my family lived for generations, and that's where my parents and my brother were born. So, any questions so far on anti-Semitism? Just to give you a background. Now, under Hitler, one of the things also that he did, and I'll go more into that, but in 1933, Hitler came to power. He was staunchly anti-communist. He blamed what happened to Germany in the First World War on the Jews. But as I said, there were less than 600,000 Jews in Germany. So why them? Because they said they were the financiers. You hear that a lot even today. And, you know, it's taking a minority and using minorities as scapegoats. In the First World War, just as an example, percentage-wise, there were more Jews soldiers killed, German soldiers killed, than any other group in Germany. So they were in the fighting, they were in the, you know, so forth. And actually, conditions for Jews in Germany were a lot better than they were in the United States at that time. They had full opportunities and so forth. But that changed when Hitler came to power. It happened almost immediately when he came to power. In 1933, and he came to power legally. The Nazi Party got 30% of the vote in 1933, or 32. That made him the major power in Germany, and so he became chancellor in 1933. The first thing he did when he became chancellor, within months, came up with enabling laws, which is like, you know, creating laws, and basically created a boycott of Jewish stores in April of 1933. In May 1933, there were major burnings of Jewish books, and so he started going after them. But Hitler wasn't trying to kill the Jews, because there weren't that many in Germany. He just wanted them to leave, to make Germany unified, free of Jews. That was his intent. And then he came in 1935. I don't know if any of you have heard about the Nuremberg race laws, but they defined a Jew in Germany if 3 out of 4 grandparents were Jewish. It didn't matter if you converted. It didn't matter if you didn't have any religion. You gave it up completely. You became an atheist or whatever. It didn't matter. And that's what you talk about ethnic. It's racial. It didn't matter who you were, but just your ancestry determined whether you were Jewish or not. That's not unusual. Okay? The other groups that are marked that same way. And it comes up in history, it was a continuation. So in 1935, we had the Nuremberg race laws. As I said, 3 out of 4. If 2 out of 4, you were like mixed, half Jew. And there were less restrictions. And they started putting on, made it very difficult, tried to force people to leave Germany between 1933 and 34 until 1939. However, and some people got out, including some of my family, but many did not. And the culmination was actually, you've always heard about Kristallnacht, right? Most of you probably heard it. Night of the Broken Glass. And that was in 1938, November of 38, when he went and started going, burned down thousands of Jewish businesses were destroyed, burned, and about 30,000 Jews were sent to concentration camps. Now, you've heard of concentration camps, and there were thousands and thousands of slave labor camps and so forth during the war. Concentration camps were unique because they were run specifically by the German SS. The first one was Dachau in 1933. There were several more built, but they were not for the Jews. Jews did not go to concentration camps until 1938. And even then, there was only the men that went, and many of them were allowed to leave if they could get out of the country or go someplace else. So that was the whole point. Hitler wanted Jews to leave. There were several incidents that you probably may never have heard of. In July 1939, in May 1939, there was a ship called St. Louis. 900 passengers that were Jews. They had temporary visas to get in or to go to Cuba. It was a German ship, okay, but it was called St. Louis. But in any event, the ship got to Cuba, and Cuba would not allow them to land at the behest of the United States. The ship turned around and went back to Europe. About 300 to 400 got off in England, and the others were spread out throughout Europe. Other ships did get through. So Jews did get out of Germany, but it was very difficult. There's a place called the Shanghai Ghetto. About 25,000 Jews got out of there in 1938-39. And because they were able to get book passage, Shanghai was a free city, didn't require a visa, and so they could leave. Germany allowed the Jews to leave if they could get a visa from another country. But most countries would not give them a visa. So in July of 1938, there was a conference called the Evian Conference. It didn't sound like, what, 32 countries, and it was called by Nossen. Roosevelt, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Roosevelt called for 32 countries, got it together in a place called Evian, France. All of these conferences were, different like that. And what happened was 32 countries showed up, and the whole purpose of it was Germany went there and said, take my Jews. Now you're talking about German Jews, as I said, there were 500,000 or 600,000. Some of them had already left, some got to Palestine, but the British didn't let them go to Palestine either, limited. So there were limits. Nobody would take the Jews. This was in 1938. Kristallnacht was in November and is a direct result of that. Basically saying, hey, if you don't care about the Jews, I don't care either. So that's what he ended up doing. It got worse. This whole thing got worse with the Holocaust when in September of 1939, when Hitler invaded to Western Europe. And now suddenly he's got Jews there. But he handled them a little differently. He didn't put them in camps or anything initially. Then in 1941, Hitler invaded Russia. But now, instead of having hundreds of thousands of Jews, he's got millions. Poland alone had 3 million Jews, over 3 million. Just to give you an idea, 90% of those died in the Holocaust. And so most of the 6 million Jews that died in the Holocaust, 5 million came from Eastern Europe. Okay. So that's when he started coming up with the idea of the Warsaw Ghetto system that you've heard about. And then you start seeing these death camps. Eventually in 1942, it morphed into death camps. Okay. And that's, how it developed. It didn't start that way, but it ended up that way. It just got, this is what happens. So by the end of the war, 6 million Jews died, and another 6 million, primarily Russian prisoners of war and Polish civilians, and other groups died as well. So that's how we get to the 12 million. And the Holocaust, when we commemorate the Holocaust, it's about the 12 million, not just the Jews. However, the Jews and the Gypsies were the only ones that were specifically marked for annihilation. The others died because of the conditions, the work conditions, how they were treated, mistreatment, and so forth. Jews were specifically sent, and they were the only ones that were sent to the death camps. Okay. Most concentration camps were not death camps. They're separation. So in the death camps, there were probably around a dozen of them. The most famous was, and about 3 million Jews died in the death camps. Not all by gas, much of it by gas. Different types of gas, carbon monoxide, shots of shootings, many different ways. So my story is somewhat different. My parents were German, as I said, and they were able to get, any questions so far, by the way? Okay. I'll open it up more later. So my parents ended up, the story is different, and we had, by the way, we had relatives that made it to the United States. I had relatives in Israel, Palestine at the time, in Shanghai Ghetto, the Dominican Republic. I had people try to get wherever they could, but they were not, found it very difficult to get into the United States. Our story was different. My father was an engineer, had a doctorate in engineering, worked for a German company. They lived in Berlin. My brother was born there in 1930, and he was able to sort of handwriting on the wall and was able to get to Denmark to work for a subsidiary. I don't know if this is better or not, but my arm is getting tight. Okay, so he got into a subsidiary in Denmark for a German company. He was able to work there for 18 months. My brother and my mother went with him. I wasn't born yet. And then in 1935, he had only 18 months, so he ended up in Belgium. And then in 1936, he took a job with the Dutch company and settled in Amsterdam, Holland. I was born in Amsterdam, Holland, Netherlands, in 1938. So, but, remember what I mentioned about birthright? Holland did not have birthright. So I was never a Dutch citizen, even though I was born there. I could become one at 18 by registering, going into the military and so forth, but I was not a citizen automatically. I think this is one of the things that is, birthright is primarily in the newer countries, in the Americas, but in Europe it's still few and far between. And now that's why it's so much of an issue with immigration today. So I was born in Amsterdam in 1938. My parents lived there, but after Kristallnacht, about 15 family members joined us. To get out, they got as far as Amsterdam, they got as far as Holland. A lot of them got there, and so 15 of them got there, and they did not get out. They were stuck there. They couldn't go any further. In 1940, Hitler invaded Western Europe. Nobody expected him to invade Holland. I call it Holland, so I'll just use that. And the reason was because Holland was not in the First World War. It was neutral. They have very close ties with Germany. Languages are somewhat similar. They are considered Germanic. And that, by the way, is a big difference. Hitler thought, because again, the racial overtones, he considered Slavs as second class, and Eastern Europe are Slavs. Whereas the Germanic people, which was Scandinavian, France, and so forth, and Holland, Belgium, and he considered they were the same. They were considered Germanic, as is Germany. And that's, again, it's much of what was happening as far as the people was racial or ethnic. Now, they're all Europeans, but it's a tribal concept. By the way, most Jews, even today, We are basically European. We are not from the Middle East. We have very little DNA from the Middle East. We're what they call the Ashkenazi Jews. These are from Southern Europe, and so forth. So, you know, there's no monolithic Jew either, basically, if you're talking about ethnicity. But it doesn't matter. It's the only thing where your religion defines you, as well as a race. But in any event, we ended up in Amsterdam in my parents ended up there in 36, and I was born there in 1938. All right, so what is our story? That's where the story really starts for us. In Germany, we had a very close family. We were living in an eastern part of Germany that had been Polish 200 years before, but it was completely German. The Poles were driven out and Germans moved in. You know, there was cities, and by the way, at the end of the war, after the war, it was to return to Germany, 200 years after Germany took it over. But that's the way territory happened with territory throughout the ages. So we ended up in there, so now we are in, so we didn't have from 1933, 35, all of the things going on that happened in Germany. But in 1940, when the Germans came in, the first thing they did was register all the Jews. And, but they left us alone. So we were living in the same house we did since 1936. But after 38, 39, we had about, as I said, 15 family members. It was actually, you know, ended up joining us there. And that's as far as they could go. My brother and myself and my parents, of the 15 or more people that were there, we were the only survivors. The others all died, including my grandfather. My grandmother died on my father's side, died in Holland in 1942, but that was disease. But, so we had a tough life. But my father went to work every day. In 1940, you could still go to school, but they put limits on it. In 1941, they started putting restrictions as far as going to swimming pools, theaters, or anything like that on the Jews. They're trying to isolate the Jews from the rest of the community. Now, Jews represented about 130,000 people in the ones in Holland. Now, there were other groups, but it's a similar size and maybe a little larger in other countries in Western Europe. You're not talking millions, or anything close to it. But so the Jews, even in Germany, were left alone, physically. Well, you know, they were not sent to the camps, as I said earlier. In 1941, they started putting more and more restrictions on it, and in 1942, they closed down the schools for students. Now, I was too young for that, but so what happened? The Jewish community in Amsterdam set up schools, private, their own schools. And my brother went to the school, and it was the same school as Anne Frank, but he was a year behind her. So her story is somewhat similar. Her parents left Austria in 1934, ended up in Amsterdam, went to the school, but she stayed in the school a couple of months, and then they went into hiding. My parents did not go into hiding. They were out in public. My father went to work every single day throughout this period. Whenever we lived, that's what he did. In 1942, we were still in the same house. In January of 1943, my grandfather, who was there, was taken from us. And what they would do, they would come in with German soldiers would come in along with Dutch police and take people individually, put them in on trucks and deport them to the camps. They took my grandfather My mother, I was there when she was there, when she was she tried to stop the Germans from taking him, and they threatened her that if she didn't stop, they would take her as well. We never heard from him again, okay? And the only thing we could imagine, now he was close to 80, the only thing we could imagine is that he ended up in the death camps, most likely Auschwitz. And those that went to Auschwitz at that point, if you went directly to the gas chambers, there's no record of it. There's a record of transport to some degree, but there's no record of them. If you were a prisoner there, there's a record of every Auschwitz prisoner. The Germans kept exceptional records. I'm not doing that. Okay, so bottom line, so we already were in 1942-43. So what happened in 1943 that changed things for us? I mean, we were living with restrictions, but still in the same house. In 1943, they shut the schools down, so my brother could no longer go to school, and they started deporting Jews from Western Europe to the camps. And the first one, okay. This is what happened is they didn't send us to ghettos. They didn't send us to any place. What they did, they rounded us up, and this was true in Western Europe. Throughout Western Europe, they sent us to a place called, in Holland, it was Westerbork. Got it? Okay. This is a person being waiting to go on one of the camps. Right? This is the transport. So these are pictures of Westerbork. Westerbork was established in the 1930s, actually in 1938, as a refugee camp for Jews fleeing into Germany, from Germany. The Germans took the camp and made it into what we call a transit camp. There were people living there. Conditions were not the greatest, but we were all together. And we didn't have uniforms. By the way, we never wore striped uniforms throughout the war. Okay. This is boarding roll call for everybody. And the people in the front were the leaders of the, designated leaders, the Jewish leaders of the camp. That's just a picture of it. These are the types of cars. You've heard about the boxcars. Well, these are it, among others. We were transported by a boxcar, and similar to this, and that was and what they were, the boxcars were basically cattle cars, because they had rooms, they had some...
Harris Reguera for front reception. Harris Reguera for front reception.
So they had portable type spaces, that you could turn down. Anybody ever seen a boxcar? The museum or anywhere? Okay. Similar to that. We have one, the museum has one from 1919 from the Austrian railway system. So they were designed for cattle, they were actually cattle cars that they used. Now this, just keep on that. This is a piece of paper. While we were there, Before that, my parents were on what they called the Palestine list, which was designed, the Germans, as I said earlier, the Germans would let Jews go as long as you had a place to go. Palestine was one of the ones. We could not get in because the British wouldn't allow us. They limited the number of Jews that got into Palestine during the Second World War, or even before the war, pretty much even before the war. So what happened, there were people that were smuggling Jews out of countries. We were able, and this is 1943, to get El Salvador certificates of citizenship for El Salvador. Okay? And it was through the consulate in Geneva. If you look at the document, if anybody who reads French, it's in French, not Dutch. So it's in French, but El Salvador is a Spanish-speaking country. So we got those well, let me back up a moment. In September, we were allowed to go back to Amsterdam because my father's company said that he was working doing defense work for the Germans, and they said they needed him. So we were allowed to go back to Amsterdam in September of 1943. So we were there in Westerbork for about 3 months. But we lost our apartment, we lost all of our possessions, so we ended up living in a tenement. But again, my father started going to work. But now we had these papers, and these papers called, the Germans looked at us as Americans in a sense. We were no longer Dutch or German. So these papers gave us a nationality that kind of protected us from that. We were still limited to concerns and so forth. But that piece of paper kept us out of the camps for another year. So we were able to live with a little bit more freedom from September 1944 to September of 1945. So you know what happened in 1944. In August and June of 1944, you had Normandy. The Allies landed, liberated France, liberated Belgium, and liberated the southern portion of Holland. Where we were in Amsterdam, they didn't bother. And where we were, Amsterdam was not liberated until April of 1945, a month before the war was over. Too late for us. And we ended up in a place called, first, again, Westerbork, and then we were in a place called Theresienstadt, or Terezin. Terezin was a fortress town built in the late 1700s as a fortress, and then converted to a garrison town, and eventually they closed down, and there were about 7,000 or 8,000 people living there. It is in Czechoslovakia, about 30 miles from Prague. But this is the camp. There are two parts to the camp. The left side is the small fortress, which is the Star Fortress, which became a concentration camp for workers and so forth. And also Jews were put there, usually, and then the right one, that's the small fortress, the right one was the ghetto of Theresienstadt. The ghetto of Theresienstadt is famous because it was used by the Germans as a model ghetto. And they invited the Swedish Red Cross there in the summer of '44, and had different things, ball courts and like not restaurants, but the cafeterias and all that open to them. But the conditions were not the greatest, to say the least. These are the barracks. the people waiting online for food. Now, a ghetto operated within the ghetto. The Jews ran the ghetto under the control of the Germans. So they were responsible for the education and so forth. They were responsible for maintaining the hospital and so forth. My parents, so we got there in September of 44. It took us about 36-hour ride in a boxcar, one of these boxcars, with just water, some water, and a slop bucket, and that was it. You didn't have any food or anything. Fortunately, the weather was pretty moderate, so it didn't affect us physically. We were then taken and we lived there until liberation in 1945. Now, in that, this, by the way, is the crematorium at Theresienstadt, and all of the camps had crematoriums. Why? Well, latitude-wise, you're up in, like, by the time you get, they're at the same latitude as Canada, so like Newfoundland, Nova Scotia. In the winter, it's cold, so cold they can't even bury the bodies. So that's why they use cremation. But the interesting thing about the cremation, at the end of the war, there were about 30,000 people that were there, that died there in the camp. I'll get back to that in a moment. And they were cremated, but near the end of the war, before the camp was liberated, they took the ashes and threw them in the river because they didn't want anyone to know how many people had died in Theresienstadt, because that was their model ghetto. Of the 150,000 people that went through there, over 30,000 died there, and only 15,000 survived. 10% survived. The rest, most of them were shipped up to Auschwitz. Fortunately, and many of them died even later. And when you go there, you'll see a sign for both places. You know, the ghetto, which is a museum. Now, what the ghetto was famous for eventually was the children's artwork and so forth. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it really, because there were children it was almost like an orphanage, and that's what they did. Most of them died. So we came back, and this is the cemetery there, you can see. 15,000 came back out. Many of them had physical illnesses and so forth. Now, we ended up in a DP camp for about a month because, the transition, but because we were American, quote-unquote American, El Salvadoran, we were turned over to the Americans. And eventually, in June 1945, we were back in Amsterdam. And my parents, my father's company got us they got an apartment for them through Dutch, that had been used by a German sympathizer that supported the Germans. Okay. This is the killing mark. So anytime there was a problem, you acted up in a camp. Now, when we were in a camp, my mother worked in the hospital and got extra rations. They hid rations from the Germans. My father worked in the laboratory. My brother ended up spending most of his time there in the hospital because he contracted TB, tuberculosis. Eventually, in June 1945, we were able to go back to Amsterdam at that point. So as I said, we got an apartment, and my father went back to the same company. My brothers went back to school, and I started school. So I lost a year of schooling in the process. My brother, in 1948, he graduated high school, gymnasium, and also in 1948, the Russians were on the march. So my parents decided to come to the United States. We had no family left in Europe. So in July of 1948, they got German visas, because nobody was using the German visa, and they were still considered German, and we came to, in July 1948, and we settled in Paterson, New Jersey. Anybody familiar with Paterson, New Jersey? Okay. Oh, sorry. It's about 30 miles, not even 30 miles outside of New York. And why there? Because my mother's sister, who had been in the Dominican Republic, eventually got to the States, and that's where they settled, and they sponsored us. We did have some relatives in the United States that made it out before the war. Many of them settled in New York. One of the relatives was a person called Winkler, and Henry Winkler is my second cousin, for anybody who knows him. It used to be when I talked to kids, they knew him. Nowadays, no young people, but he's an actor, okay? So that's really, from there, we lived the American dream. And what does that mean? We went to school. My father set up a laboratory in Paterson, got some government work and so forth. We ended up moving to another town called Fairlawn in New Jersey. That's where, and I went to school. I started the 5th grade, didn't know a word of English. When we got there, I spoke German and Dutch. But they sent me to a YMHA, and they had people that spoke German or Yiddish, and it's close enough so I was able to communicate. And that was in the summer. And I started school in September. I had and I had to learn English, and so forth. But it didn't take long. At 10, it's not very long. My brother spoke English before. My parents spoke English as well, so it was not an issue for them. We came down here, and I worked primarily in New York. I was in the military for over 4 years, and then stayed in the reserves for another 30 years. So I'm retired military. And the rest is pretty straightforward. We came to Florida 30 years ago, and my children were all born in New Jersey, and they all now live in Florida. 2 of them in Naples, which is very unusual for snowbirds or even retirees, so we're fortunate. And that is my story. Okay. We have time for questions. So anybody have any questions? Yes. You're going to have to, I'm sorry, you're going to have to speak up. I'm sorry? The what? I'm sorry. The last word I missed.
He said, how do you feel about the liberation?
The liberation? When? After the war, we were thrilled. But we didn't have anything. The other thing is that one of the problems of liberation, Holland was poor at that point. They had gone through a war. Of the Jews, by the way, just to give you an idea, the 130,000 Jews in Holland, of the over 100,000 were shipped out, only 5,000 came back, 5%. Most of them, there were about 20,000 Jews in hiding. Most of them, 2/3 of them survived. And there were Jews in mixed marriages and so forth that were not deported. But, liberation, we were glad to be alive. That's basically it. And we went on with our lives. So what you do? No, they don't have a mic. Anybody? Yes, back there. You're going to have to stand up.
I was a part of a play called Royal Block 66. It's based on the story of Ocean Hessler.
I'm sorry.
Guys, you gotta be quiet so we can hear.
Let me come further down.
I'll give her the microphone.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, hi. I was recently a part of a play called Boy from Block 66. It's based on the story of Moshe Kessler. He was a survivor. He went through Auschwitz, Birkenau, and all that stuff. I just want to ask you, what's your opinion on like the Holocaust being portrayed in media and arts? Like, how important do you think that is?
I'm not sure how I feel about it or what. To me, people are forgetting the Holocaust. Only 25% of the people who refer to know about the Holocaust, believe it happened or whatever. It's a sign of the times, of what happened before. One of the things that you have when you see this, and I'm not necessarily, right now, by the way, there are only about 16 or 17 million Jews throughout the world. Think about it, 17 million. That's it. About half live in the United States, about 6 million in the United States, 7 million or more in Israel. That's it. And then other countries spread out throughout Europe and so forth. We are under constant threat for whatever. It's the only place I know where if you are a Jew in the United States, you are blamed for what's happening in Israel. That doesn't happen with any other group. We are responsible, and this is the thing that bothers me most about what's happening today about anti-Semitism. It has nothing to do with what we believe in or how we believe, whether we agree with the policy or not. We are identified with Israel. Now, we support Israel because it's the only place. I can go to Israel today and be a citizen there automatically. They have a right of return. This is my country. I spent 34 years in the military, okay? And which most of it in the reserves, but I was active reserve, most of it also. And I love this country. I would not go any place else. But to be considered something that as other, and it's not just what bothers me more is the fact that it's not just about the Jews, anti-Semitism, it's anti-Asian, this is a country that's going backwards. Because we're not a white country anymore, okay? For whatever people think and how you define white, racially we are Caucasian. So you can't even call it, that's what I'm saying, it doesn't define itself. But until we fully accept everybody for who they are as individuals, not by their color or their skin or their religion or so forth, we're going to continue to have this. It's unfortunate. Okay, anybody, another question, anybody? Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to know, how did the Holocaust affect you? How do you think we could move forward without this happening again?
It didn't, since I was young. The question is, how did the Holocaust affect me? Very little. In that sense, because I was young. It affected my parents more, but you're a survivor. That's why they call them survivors. You go on. I'll give you an example of some people that can. My aunt, she was in Shanghai ghetto. Her first husband died there. She married my uncle. She was worked and had a good job in the United States, working with children. And 30 years later, she committed suicide. You never know. I know it affected my brother because he was a teenager. It affected him a lot more than it affected me. So, you know, my father was very practical, and he was an engineer, and he just looked ahead. He never looked back. My mother was pretty good that way as well. These lights. Okay, anybody else? Yes, back there.
Is that you?
I'm sorry? That's me. Oh, I forgot to tell you. That's the one we didn't talk about. I became a citizen in 1955. My parents, the normal time to become a citizen, we were residents. We came in on a visa, permanent visa. We were residents. It takes 5 years